Welcome to this, the fifth in a series of short talks covering the key agreements used by the upstream oil and gas industry. This presentation continues to look at joint operation agreements by reviewing the common provisions found in a joint operation agreement. I hope you find it useful. Your feedback is most welcome. Joint operation agreements are complex with many variations and alternatives, so it is not possible to cover all the options. However, I aim to give a flavour of some of the issues to be considered, and of course I am happy to speak to my viewers on a one-to-one basis to give more detailed advice. My contact details are shown on this slide and also given at the end. We provide services to the oil and gas industry worldwide, and I have 30 years of experience. In this part 4, I discuss some of the common provisions found in a joint operation agreement. Let's quickly recap before we move on. In part 1, I explained why we need joint operation agreements. And in part 2, I listed the key constituent features to be found in a joint operation agreement. And in part 3, I examined the form and structure of a joint operation agreement. Duration. It is common for the joint operation agreement to continue in being until everything concerning the joint venture is over, i.e. the license has ended, all joint venture property has been disposed of, all decommissioning has been completed, and a final accounting has been prepared, agreed and performed. The scope of the joint operation agreement will be defined to apply to operations performed with respect to the license and will exclude operations performed otherwise. In many jurisdictions, it will explicitly exclude the marketing of the hydrocarbons themselves, reflecting that for many companies they are prohibited by law from joint marketing. There will be a clear statement of the participating interests of the joint venture parties. And as mentioned in previous presentations, it will set out the rights and obligations of the operator and will include provisions for changing the operator. Likewise, the joint operating agreement will set out the rights and obligations of the operating committee and the procedures for calling meetings of the operating committee. As mentioned in an earlier presentation, the joint operating agreement will include procedures for agreeing the work programs and budgets and the authority for expenditure. Different thresholds for triggering the need for an AFE may exist for exploration, development, production and decommissioning phases. The joint operating agreement is likely to include special rules to provide for sole risk operations. Generally, an operation can only be proposed for a sole risk operation if that operation was initially proposed as a joint venture operation, which was rejected by the operating committee. Usually, the right for parties to propose the operation as a sole risk operation must be exercised within a defined period after the operating committee has rejected it for joint operations. If an operation is proposed as a sole risk operation, the other parties have a right to join in, the interest in the sole risk operation being pro rata to the joint operating agreement participating interests of the sole risk parties joining in. If all the joint operating agreement parties elect to join in, then the sole risk operation reverts to being a joint operation. It is usual for the non-participating parties to have a right to back in to a sole risk operation subsequent to it having been performed. But to do so, they must pay a premium, reflecting that they are doing so with hindsight and the risk of the operation has been removed. The parties should consider the premium to be paid in order to back in, so that parties are discouraged from standing back from joint operations and allowing the other parties shouldering all the risk. As with all agreements, there will be provisions to deal with default by a party. The most clearly envisaged form of default is that of a party not paying its share of an invoice or cash call. It is usual for a party in default to have its voting rights suspended until the default is cured. If there is production available under the joint venture, it may be that the non-defaulting parties will have a right to use the defaulting party's share of the petroleum towards paying off the default. It used to be the case that the ultimate sanction of a default, if not cured, was that the non-defaulting parties could acquire the defaulting parties' participating interest for free. but more recently there has been a move away from this, with the non-defaulting parties required to pay the market rate, possibly discounted, in order to avoid the possibility that the right to acquire the interest for free is declared a penalty and thus non-enforceable. Force majeure is the usual type of provisions for force majeure. The joint operating agreement will include a provision requiring and entitling each joint venture party to receive and dispose of their share of petroleum produced by the joint venture. This is often reflected in procedures for lifting and disposing of hydrocarbons, either as a separate schedule to the joint operating agreement or as a standalone agreement referred to by the joint operating agreement. The joint operating agreement will set out rules for ownership and access to data, and the joint venture parties will have an obligation to keep the joint venture data confidential. It is also likely that the joint operating agreement will have a clear statement that the joint venture parties are not a partnership. It is usual that there be explicit provisions governing the right of parties to assign, that is, to sell their interest in the license and joint operating agreement. It was once common for these provisions to include a right for the other parties to preempt the sale and acquire the interest themselves by matching an offer made by a bona fide purchaser. Older joint operating agreements may still include rights of preemption, but preemption rights are frowned upon by many jurisdictions, and so preemption rights are less common in modern joint operating agreements. As with most agreements, there will be explicit rules for serving notices, and I am frequently surprised by the general disregard of contractual rules for serving notices, with many notices served by methods not recognised in agreements, such as sending by email, when a contract does not list email as a valid method. In my view, this is very sloppy and can be an expensive mistake. I'm aware of at least one instance when the failure to follow the rules set out for serving notice cost the party who failed to follow the rules many millions of pounds due to their notice not being effective. There will also be rules for making public announcements. This is an area that can cause a surprising amount of unhappiness amongst the joint venture parties. Problems arise when small and large companies are both party to the same joint operating agreement. What is a material event to the smaller company is frequently seen as a minor irritation by the bigger company. And when the smaller company releases information, often as a result of a requirement to comply with stock exchange rules, the larger company feels that the obligation to maintain confidentiality has been breached. It is usual for the joint operating agreement to include accounting procedures as a schedule to the agreement. These will typically reflect the internal procedures of the party appointed to be the operator. The main point to look out for is whether the operator will issue cash calls, i.e. whenever money needs to be spent, the operator asks for each party to provide their share of it in advance, or whether the operator will provide the finance and include a financing cost when re-invoicing the cost back to the non-operators. The model joint operating agreement provided by AIPN is very similar to that provided by Oil and Gas UK, but it also includes a number of special provisions not included in the Oil and Gas UK model. This is because the AIPN model is used frequently in international settings, and the extra terms reflect this. The AIPN model joint operating agreement includes an option for special terms relating to natural gas. Often, in an international setting, the license or production sharing contract issued will include special rules for the production and disposal of natural gas. It may require the contractor party to provide natural gas free of charge to a party designated by the host government, or it may require it to be sold to a state-owned utility company on predefined terms, or it may give rights to the contractor party to commercialise it within a specified time period. Whatever the rules set out in the license or production sharing contract, it is likely that they will need to be reflected in the joint operating agreement. It is increasingly the case that a production sharing contract will have special rules regarding change of control of one of the contractor parties, even if the change of control is a corporate transaction executed at the highest level. It may require the consent of the government party under a production sharing contract before the change of control is effective regarding that production sharing contract. New joint operating agreements, therefore, often contain provisions reflecting this requirement and provides for the possibility that consent is not granted by the government party. Sovereign immunity or crown immunity is a legal doctrine by which the sovereign or state cannot commit a legal wrong and is immune from civil suit or criminal prosecution. Where the host state or a state-owned company is party to the joint operating agreement, it may be necessary for the state to waive its immunity in order that the rights of the other joint operating agreement parties can be protected. Most production sharing contracts are structured to give the contractor party an enhanced share of petroleum initially, from which it is to recover costs, following which the contractor receives a smaller share of petroleum, out of which the contractor takes its profits. Depending on the production sharing contract, it may be necessary to reflect these concepts within the joint operating agreement as cost hydrocarbons and profit hydrocarbons. In our next presentation, I will discuss decommissioning security agreements. I hope that you have found this short presentation interesting. If you have any questions or would like to discuss a particular issue, please do not hesitate to contact me. You can call me on the UK 020 7100 6501 or email me at tony.dayton@blackcatenergyservices.co.uk or just Google Black Cat Energy Services to find my website.